Learn it in a burst here right at FuSha Works.
Hi students, I'm your lecturer Mr. Fun Man for CM3261 Environmental Chemistry. Today we are going to talk about the topic element cycles, and it's my pleasure to introduce to you Shaphyna, who's going to bring you through this topic.
Hey guys, I'm Shaphyna, and I'll be going through this lecture with you on element cycles. This lecture is divided up into 6 parts: the biogeochemical cycles, the water cycle, the carbon cycle, the nitrogen cycle, the phosphorus cycle, and nutrient enrichment. Let's dive into the first part of the biogeochemical cycles. Nutrients move through ecosystems in nutrient cycles, also known as biogeochemical cycles. Chemicals, elements, and molecules travel through the atmosphere, hydrosphere, and lithosphere, and from one organism to another in a dynamic equilibrium. Physical matter of an ecosystem is circulated over and over again. Nutrients and other materials move from one pool or reservoir to another, remaining for varying amounts of time in each, also known as its residence time. The rate which materials move between reservoirs is termed as flux, and flux between any given reservoirs can change over time. A reservoir that releases more materials than it accepts is called a source, and a reservoir that accepts more materials than it releases is called a sink. Now let's take a look at a real-life example of Chesapeake Bay in the early 2000s. The native eastern oyster, Crassotria virginica populations had dropped by 99% in Chesapeake Bay in 2001. The Chesapeake's oyster industry, one of the largest in the world, had collapsed. This was due to a multitude of reasons, including poor water quality, reef destruction, virulent diseases spread by transplanted oysters, and 200 years of overharvesting. This ultimately led to the destruction of oyster reefs. Since oysters settle and grow best on reefs, artificial reefs were then constructed to get oysters off the bottom of the sea, away from smothering sediments and hypoxic waters. This was an effort to push them up into the plankton-rich upper waters to allow them to grow and thrive better. After a few years of implementation, the oyster populations on the constructed reefs were sampled in 2007. The reef complex supported about 185 million oysters compared to the wild population of 200 million oysters living in the remaining degraded habitat in all of Maryland, showing the success of the artificial reefs. Next, let's move on to how human activity can affect fluxus. Human activity has increased the flux of nitrogen from the atmosphere to the reservoirs on Earth. On the other hand, it has also increased the flux of carbon from the reservoirs on Earth to our atmosphere in the form of carbon dioxide. Biogeochemical cycles involve negative feedback loops that promote dynamic equilibrium. However, some human actions can generate destabilizing positive feedback loops on various element cycles. And that brings us to the end of the first part of biogeochemical cycles. Now let's move on to the second part, the water cycle. Water carries nutrients, sediments, and pollutants from the continents to the oceans via surface runoff, streams, and rivers. These materials can be carried for thousands of miles on ocean currents. Water also carries atmospheric pollutants to the Earth's surface when they dissolve in falling rain or snow. The water cycle, or hydrologic cycle, summarizes how water, in liquid, solid, or gaseous forms, flows through the environment. Oceans are the main reservoir in the water cycle, holding 97% of all water on Earth. Fresh water, what we need to survive, accounts for less than 3%, and 2/3 of the amounts are trapped in glaciers, snowfields, and ice caps. Less than 1% are in forms we can readily use, and that includes groundwater, surface fresh water, and rain from atmospheric water vapor. In the water cycle, we're going to talk about 4 parts: evaporation and transpiration, precipitation, runoff, and surface water, groundwater, and the human impact on the water cycle. Firstly, let's look into evaporation and transpiration. Water moves from oceans, lakes, ponds, rivers, and moist soil into the atmosphere via evaporation, which are sped up by warm temperatures, strong winds, and a greater degree of exposure. For example, if an area is locked of its forests or converted into an agricultural or residential area, it would lose water more readily than a vegetated area. Water also enters the atmosphere via transpiration, which is the release of water vapor by plants through their leaves. On a smaller scale, water also enters the atmosphere when it evaporates from the surface of organisms through perspiration or sweating. Transpiration and evaporation act as natural processes of distillation, as water escaping into the air as gas leaves behind its dissolved substances. Next, let's move on to precipitation, runoff, and surface water. Water returns from the atmosphere to the Earth's surface as precipitation when water vapor condenses and falls as rain or snow. This moisture may be taken up by plants and used by animals, but much of it flows as runoff into streams, rivers, lakes, ponds, and oceans. The amount of precipitation varies greatly from region to region, helping give rise to our planet's variety of biomes. Now, let's talk about groundwater. Some precipitation and surface runoff water soaks down through soil and rock and becomes groundwater, which is water found beneath layers of soil. Groundwater recharges aquifers, which are sponge-like regions of rock and soil that are underground reservoirs of water. The upper limit of groundwater held in an aquifer is referred to as the water table. Aquifers can hold groundwater for long periods of time, so the water can be quite ancient. In some cases, the groundwater takes hundreds or thousands of years to recharge fully after being depleted. Groundwater becomes surface water when it emerges from springs or flows into streams, rivers, lakes, or the ocean from the soil. Lastly, let's move on to the human impacts on the water cycle. Human activity affects every aspect of the water cycle. Here are some examples. Damming rivers slows down the movement of water from land to sea. Holding water in reservoirs increases evaporation. Removing natural vegetation by clear-cutting and developing land increases surface runoff, decreases infiltration and transpiration, and promotes soil erosion. Withdrawals of surface water and groundwater for agriculture, industry, and domestic use depletes rivers, lakes, and streams, and lowers water tables. The emission of pollutants into the atmosphere that dissolve in water droplets changes the chemical nature of precipitation, therefore sabotaging the natural distillation process that evaporation and transpiration provide. Water shortages also has given rise to conflicts worldwide. And that brings us to the end of the water cycle. Next, let's talk about the carbon cycle. Carbon is a definitive component of organic molecules. The carbon cycle describes the routes that carbon atoms take through the environment. In the carbon cycle, we'll be talking about 4 parts: photosynthesis, respiration and food webs, sediment storage of carbon, the oceans, and the human impact on the carbon cycle. Photosynthesis, respiration, and food webs. Producers such as plants, algae, and cyanobacteria pull carbon dioxide out of the atmosphere and out of surface water to use in photosynthesis. Photosynthesis converts carbon dioxide and water into glucose and oxygen. Autotrophs use some of these carbohydrates to fuel cellular respiration, thereby releasing some carbon back into the atmosphere and oceans as carbon dioxide. When producers are eaten by primary consumers, which are then subsequently eaten by secondary and tertiary consumers, more carbohydrates are broken down in cellular respiration, producing carbon dioxide and water. The same process occurs when decomposers consume waste and dead organic matter. Organisms use carbon for structural growth, so a portion of the carbon is incorporated into its tissues. Since carbon dioxide is a greenhouse gas, much research on global climate change is directed towards measuring the amount of CO2 plants store to see how it influences the Earth's climate. Next is the sediment storage of carbon. When aquatic organisms die, their remains may settle in sediments in ocean basins or freshwater wetlands. As sediment accumulates, older layers are buried more deeply, experiencing higher pressure over long periods of time. These conditions can convert soft tissues into fossil fuels such as coal, oil, and natural gas, and can turn shells and skeletons into sedimentary rocks such as limestone. Carbon trapped in sedimentary rocks may reside there for hundreds of millions of years. Carbon trapped in sediments and fossil fuel deposits may eventually be released into the oceans or atmosphere by geologic processes such as uplift, erosion, and volcanic eruptions. It also re-enters the atmosphere when we extract and burn fossil fuels. Next, we'll be talking about the oceans. The ocean is the second largest reservoir in the carbon cycle. They absorb carbon-containing compounds from the atmosphere, terrestrial runoff, from undersea volcanoes, and from waste products and detritus of marine organisms. Some examples include carbon dioxide, carbonate ions, and bicarbonate ions. Bicarbonate ions combine with calcium ions to form calcium carbonate, an essential ingredient in skeletons or shells. When an organism dies, their calcium carbonate shells sink to the ocean floor and begin to form sedimentary rock. The rates at which the oceans absorb and release carbon depend on many factors, including temperature and the number of marine organisms converting carbon dioxide into carbohydrates and carbonates. Lastly, we'll be discussing the human impact on the carbon cycle. One of our main impacts is shifting carbon from the lithosphere to the atmosphere. Mining fossil fuel deposits removes carbon from underground reservoirs with residence time of millions of years. Combustion of fossil fuels in our automobiles, homes, and industries release carbon dioxide and greatly increases the flux of carbon from the ground to the air. Since the mid-18th century, combustion of fossil fuels has added over 276 billion tons of carbon dioxide into the atmosphere. The movement of carbon dioxide from atmosphere back into the hydrosphere, lithosphere, and biosphere has not kept pace. Cutting down a forest removes carbon from the pool of vegetation and releases it back into the air. If less vegetation is left on the surface, there are fewer plants to draw CO2 back out of the atmosphere. The ongoing flux of carbon into the atmosphere is the driving force behind today's anthropogenic global climate change. Some excess carbon dioxide in the atmosphere is now being absorbed by ocean water, thereby increasing its acidity and threatening marine life. Our understanding of the carbon cycle is not complete. There is a missing carbon sink. Of the carbon dioxide emitted by fossil fuel combustion and deforestation, researchers have measured how much goes into the atmosphere and oceans. However, roughly 2.3 to 2.6 billion metric tons of carbon remains unaccounted for. Many scientists believe that CO2 must be taken up by plants or soil of the temperate and boreal forests. If certain forests are acting as a major sink for carbon, we would like to keep it that way. If this forest were to turn from sinks to sources and begin releasing the missing carbon, climate change could accelerate drastically. And that brings us to the end of the carbon cycle. Let's now move on to the nitrogen cycle. Nitrogen makes up 78% of our atmosphere by mass and is the sixth most abundant element on Earth. Nitrogen is an essential element in biomolecules such as proteins, DNA, and RNA, and is thus of vital importance to us and to all other organisms. The nitrogen cycle is split up into 4 parts: how nitrogen moves, nitrogen fixation, nitrogen and denitrification, as well as the human impact on the nitrogen cycle. Firstly, how nitrogen moves. Nitrogen is chemically inert and cannot cycle out of the atmosphere and into living organisms without assistance from lightning, highly specialized bacteria, or human intervention. Thus, the element is relatively scarce in the lithosphere and hydrosphere. Once it undergoes the right chemical change, it becomes biologically active and available to organisms and can act as a potent fertilizer. Its scarcity makes biologically active nitrogen a limiting factor for plant growth. Next, let's look at nitrogen fixation. To become biologically active, nitrogen gas needs to be fixed or combined with hydrogen to form ammonia. Ammonia dissolves in water to form ammonium ions, which can then be taken up by plants. This can be accomplished by the intense energy of lightning strikes, or when air in the top layer of soil comes into contact with particular types of nitrogen-fixing bacteria. These bacteria live in a mutualistic relationship with many types of plants, such as soybeans and legumes, providing them with nutrients by converting nitrogen to a usable form. Some farmers nourish soils by planting crops that host nitrogen-fixing bacteria among their roots. Nitrogen and denitrification. Specialized bacteria can perform denitrification. In this process, ammonium ions are converted into nitrite ions, and then they are converted into nitrate ions. Plants can take up these ions, which also becomes available after atmospheric deposition on soils or in water, or after application of nitrate-based fertilizers. Animals obtain the nitrogen they need by consuming plants or other animals. Decomposers obtain nitrogen from dead or decaying plant and animal matter and from animal urine and feces. Once decomposers process nitrogen-rich compounds, they release ammonium ions, making these available to nitrifying bacteria to convert again to nitrates and nitrites. Next, denitrifying bacteria converts nitrates in soil or water to nitrogen gas via a multi-step process. Denitrification thereby completes the cycle by releasing nitrogen back into the atmosphere as a gas. Lastly, we'll now talk about the human impact on the nitrogen cycle. Historically, nitrogen fixation was a bottleneck, a step that limited the flux of nitrogen out of the atmosphere. This changed with the development of the Haber-Bosch process to synthesize ammonia, a key ingredient in modern explosives and agricultural fertilizers. With the Haber-Bosch process, we have effectively doubled the rate of nitrogen fixation on Earth, overwhelming nature's denitrification abilities. By enhancing agriculture, the new fertilizers contributed to the past century's increase in human population. Fixing atmospheric nitrogen with fertilizers increases the flux of nitrogen from the atmosphere to the Earth's surface. This flux was enhanced by cultivating legume crops, whose roots host nitrogen-fixing bacteria. We reduce nitrogen's return to the air when we destroy wetlands that filter nutrients, as wetland plants host denitrifying bacteria that converts nitrates back to nitrogen gas. As such, wetlands can mop up a great deal of nitrogen pollution. Farming practices speed runoff and allow soil erosion, so nitrogen flows from farms into terrestrial and aquatic ecosystems, leading to nutrient pollution, eutrophication, and hypoxia. Burning of forests and fields also forces nitrogen out of the soils and vegetation and into the atmosphere. Burning of fossil fuels releases nitric oxide into the atmosphere, where it reacts to form nitrogen dioxide. This is a precursor to nitric acid, a key component of acid precipitation. Nitrous oxide is released when anaerobic bacteria break down the tremendous volume of animal waste produced in agricultural feedlots. Over-application of nitrogen-based fertilizers can strip the soil of other essential nutrients, such as calcium and potassium, because the fertilizer flushes them out. And this brings us to the end of the nitrogen cycle. Now, let's move on to the phosphorus cycle. Phosphorus is the key component of cell membranes, DNA, RNA, ATP, and ADP, and is vital for life. The amount of phosphorus in organisms is much smaller compared to its vast amount in rocks, soil sediments, and the oceans. Unlike the carbon and nitrogen cycles, the phosphorus cycle has no appreciable atmospheric component besides the transport of tiny amounts in wind-blown dust and sea spray. The phosphorus cycle is split up into three portions: geology and phosphorus availability, food webs, and the human impact on the phosphorus cycle. The vast majority of phosphorus is contained within rock and released only by weathering, which releases phosphate ions into water. Phosphates dissolved in lakes or in the oceans precipitate into solid form, settling to the bottom, and re-enters the lithosphere's phosphorus reservoir in sediments. Environmental concentrations of phosphorus available to organisms tend to be very low, as most phosphorus is bound up in rock and is only released very slowly. The scarcity explains why phosphorus is frequently a limiting factor for plant growth, and why an influx of phosphorus can produce immediate and dramatic effects on plants. Next, we have food webs. Aquatic producers take up phosphorus from surrounding waters, while terrestrial producers take up phosphorus from soil water through their roots. Primary consumers acquire phosphorus from plant tissues and pass it on to secondary and tertiary consumers. Consumers also pass phosphorus to the soil through excretion of waste. Decomposers break down phosphorus-rich organisms and their waste and returns phosphorus to soil as well. Lastly, let's talk about the human impact on the phosphorus cycle. We increase phosphorus concentrations in surface water through runoff of phosphorus-rich fertilizers applied to lawns and farmlands. Let's recall an earlier example of Chesapeake Bay. A 2008 study determined that an average hectare of land in Chesapeake Bay receives 4.52 kg of phosphorus per year, promoting phosphorus accumulation in soils, runoff into waterways, and phytoplankton blooms and hypoxia in the bay. Phosphorus is added to waterways through release of treated wastewater rich in phosphates from domestic use of phosphate detergents. And that brings us to the end of the phosphorus cycle. Lastly, let's talk about nutrient enrichment. Tackling nutrient enrichment requires diverse approaches. These approaches have widely varying costs for the same level of nutrient reduction. Some approaches are cheaper than others, all while creating a habitat for wildlife. Ultimately, the approaches embraced depend on the major source of nutrients for a given waterway, along with economic considerations. Let's look at some approaches to control nutrient pollution. Examples include reducing fertilizer use on farms and lawns, changing the timing of fertilizer application to minimize rainy season runoff, more effectively managing manure applications to farmland to reduce nutrient runoff, planting and maintaining vegetation buffers around streams that trap nutrient and sediment runoff, using artificial wetlands to filter stormwater and farm runoff, restoring nutrient-absorbing wetlands along waterways, improving technologies in sewage plants to enhance nitrogen and phosphorus capture, restoring frequently flooded lands to reduce runoff, upgrading stormwater systems to capture runoff from roads and parking lots, reducing fossil fuel combustion to minimize atmospheric inputs of nitrogens to waterways. And this sums up our portion on nutrient enrichment. This brings us to the end of the presentation. Thank you so much for watching, and I hope you enjoyed this video.